Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to listen. So yeah, my name's Ben Ranskin. I'm the Head of Horticulture and Agroforestry at the Soil Association, but I'm also project managing a 200-acre agroforestry planting in Wiltshire, which this is a picture from. And the Soil Association, for those that don't know, it's a charity that works around organic food and farming. We were founded in 1946, and we run various projects as well as a certification company. And our stall is just behind you, so if you do want to come and visit us later in the day, then please do. Right hand one? Or shall I use that? I'll use that, that's fine. So, agroforestry, what is it? So the name kind of explains it. You've got agro, which is the crops or animals bit, and you've got forestry, which is the tree bit. So it's the deliberate integration of trees and farming. So historically, you would have had on a farm, you have your field of sheep or your field of cows or your wheat, and then you have your woodland, which is separate. Well, this is actually bringing them deliberately together and actively managing both of them for mutual benefit. And this is sort of how it works. As you know, with plants, what you see above the ground is roughly what's below the ground. So if you're growing grass and it's only that big, that's roughly what you've got under the ground as roots. So you're effectively only using maybe 3 or 4 inches of your topsoil. And in the same way, if you're growing an annual crop, it's not in the ground for the whole year. So in the time when it's not in the ground, or even when it's really small, a lot of your soil is being wasted, and a lot of the light and the sunlight that's coming down is being wasted. It's just hitting the soil and being reflected back up. And a lot of the rain that's falling is getting wasted. Now, it might be running off or it might be flowing through the soil, but all of these natural resources that are there to be used are effectively getting wasted. If you start putting trees into the mix, you're exploiting deeper layers of the soil. So, some tree roots might go down 2-3 meters, sometimes deeper. You're catching sunlight. So most trees will come into leaf earlier than most annual plants and often will stay in leaf later. So you're capturing more sunlight. And those leaves are falling onto the soil and being incorporated into the soil. So you're capturing more of that sunlight energy, capturing more of that water, and using more of the resources that's under the ground. And here's just an example. So one of the things you might think is, well, if you're ploughing or using that soil in between, surely the tree is going to compete. Well, what you actually quite often find, so where in a normal forest situation, you'd see the roots just sort of spreading out like that. If you start cultivating the strip in between, as long as you start early enough, actually what it does is it forces the roots lower down. So you get a similar root mass, but lower down, still leaving that top layer for you to grow a crop in. So that's the kind of basic principles of how it works. And if you start looking at that extra productivity and how you might measure it or explain it, there's this concept called a land equivalence ratio. So if you imagine you're growing a hectare of monoculture, so say you're growing apples, these are not real figures obviously, but you might get, say, half a ton of apples off a whole acre, or you might get, so say you got 1 hectare of monoculture, you got a ton and a ton. So you might get a ton of wheat off a hectare, you might get a ton of apples off a hectare. If you then grow those in an integrated way, so for instance, a row of apples, a strip of wheat, a row of apples, a strip of wheat across that hectare, you think, well, maybe I'll get a half a ton of each of those, because that's what you'd expect. The reality is you tend to get more. So you might get 0.6 of a ton of apples and 0.8 of a ton of wheat. So often the increased productivity from that mixed system is usually 20 to 30% more. It can be a lot more, sometimes it's less, but on average it's up to 30%. So when you're looking at, this sort of, everyone's talking about intensification, sustainable intensification. Here's a way where potentially you can increase your productivity by 20 or 30%, and you're increasing the sustainability of the system. So what I'd like to do, that's the kind of the productivity bit, and I'll come back to some more figures in terms of productivity as well later on. There are a whole range of other benefits that come with agroforestry systems, so I'll just run through a few of these things for you now. So soil health is sort of one of the big ones, really. I mentioned already that idea that they're dropping their leaves, they're increasing the soil organic matter, and we all know that increasing soil organic matter is great for the soil. It increases the water holding capacity, increases the soil life. One of the other things that agroforestry can do, where the one thing that fungus really hates is being disturbed. And there's lots of fantastic fungi in the soil that can really benefit our crops. But every time you go in and plough, you're destroying that fungal network. And it takes time to recolonate it back into the soil from the hedgerow or wherever you've still got some undisturbed ground. With agroforestry, where you've got more areas of undisturbed ground under the trees, it's much quicker for soil life to recolonize back into your field. So what we find is that fields will recover more from where they've been cropped. So even where you've still got a cropland, you've still got to grow wheat or grow vegetable crops, actually you're having a more resilient system by letting that soil life come back in and benefit. So the other thing, I don't know how many of you have come across this concept of bacterial fungal ratios in soil. So very young soils tend to be rich in bacteria, so when they're newly formed, they're very bacterial, and then as the plants that grow on them become more complex, they become more fungal dominated. So in forest situations, you get much higher fungal ratios in your soil. And most plants, apart from things like brassicas, but most plants actually prefer a higher level of fungi in the soil than most of our soils have. So by incorporating some of these permanent areas that are richer in fungus, you're actually starting to bring your soils a little bit more back towards that fungal ratio. And that's a real benefit as well. And one of the things that these fungi do is they actually draw in nutrients from really quite a wide range. So you could be drawing in nutrients from a woodland like a mile down the road through this network of soil fungal hyphae that are sort of spread forever. And plants actually communicate through these fungal hyphae as well. So if a plant on one side of the field is getting attacked by a pest, they can communicate through this soil life and tell the plant on the other side of the field that it's getting attacked, and it can then it can start to build its defenses. So there's so much complexity under there. And the less you can disturb your soil, or the more areas of undisturbed soil you've got in your farm, the better. Anyway, I can't talk for too long. I'll get very carried away about all that sort of stuff. So water's another thing. This is not in Wales, I don't think, but it is in the UK. It was maize, harvested late, no protection put on for the winter, heavy rains, and most of that field's going to end up in the river at the bottom of the hill. Planting trees increases the ability of that soil to absorb water. The tree roots go down, they reduce compaction, they break up pans. So when we do get heavy rain, they allow it to be absorbed into the soil rather than washing off. So that's one of the big things that it can do. Probably a lot of you will have heard of the Pond Bren project, which is one of the sort of pioneering agroforestry systems. A group of farmers in Wales got together and designed, as a group, they designed a great system. They planted up actually a relatively small area of their farms to trees, but they reduced the runoff from those systems by 60 times. It's not 60%, but 60 times less runoff. So there's really powerful things that they managed to do. And the water that comes off these systems is then cleaner as well. So there's been a whole range of studies, some of which have shown that you get 70 to 90% fewer suspended solids, so that's this stuff, in water if you plant trees. You get 60 to 90% less phosphorus in the water. You get 70 to 95% less nitrogen. So you can really start to reduce some of those pollutants that are coming off. And this is just one example from a study in France that, so the one on the middle is the nitrate leaching from agriculture, the one on the right is forestry, and you can see that agroforestry is actually pretty close to forestry. So even though they're farming in this system, the nitrate leaching is negligible. So wind is another problem, and I'm guessing we don't have too many areas in Wales that are very prone to wind erosion. This is a picture from the east of England. It's not just a fuzzy out of focus photo. This is the soil being blown over in the fens in the east of England. Real issue. Planting trees obviously slows down wind and enables you to lose less soil in that situation. So one of the big ones for me is around animal health and welfare. Most of our domesticated farmed animals are by nature woodland or woodland edge animals. They like having the protection of trees. They like the shelter, they like the shade. One study even recently showed that cows are happier and their interactions with humans are better when they've got trees there. And one of the theories is actually they just like hiding. And they, if they don't feel exposed, they're happier. So there's a general animal welfare basis. But also, if you imagine if you're out in the hot sun or you're out in the driving rain or the snow, where do you want to be? You want to be in the shelter, you want to be under a tree. And it's the same for animals. Not only that, and I'll come on to this in a bit, but there's an animal welfare bit, but there's also a productivity angle there. If they're not using energy to keep warm, they can use that energy to put on extra weight or to produce more milk. So they become more profitable as well as happier. Crop health. So again, it's this idea that you're slowing down the wind. So an area of crops that are sheltered by trees can have a temperature that's 4 or 5 degrees higher. So that means earlier and later cropping potentially. It potentially means higher yields. So you can push your system more if you've got shelter. And then of course they're providing habitats for predators and pollinators. So potentially you've got healthier trees as well, or crops. And then the final one really is around resilience, and this is resilience of your business. So if you're just growing one crop, it's quite risky. If you've got multiple crops, the years that your wheat fails, your apples might be fine. So you've got a more resilient business model, even more complicated but more resilient. But you're also building a resilient farm system. Our climate is increasingly one of extremes. We don't know if it's going to be drought. We don't know if it's going to be floods. We do know that systems with trees in are more resilient at both ends of the extremes. We've looked at that flooding angle. Last year, when we had the drought, some of the only areas of green grass were the ones under trees. Counterintuitive, you think, well, but surely the trees are going to suck up the moisture. But actually, the only area growing grass last year in the heat of the summer was in the shade. And equally, if you've got no grass left, but you've got lots of willow and poplar, then your stock have still got something to eat. So potentially, you're building resilience into that system. So I thought I'd just run through a couple of examples and case studies. So this is kind of the opposite of that example I just measured, where it's the only area with no snow. So silver pasture, as the name explains, pasture, so that's animals and trees. I mentioned that idea about using energy to keep warm or to keep cool. There's numerous studies. We've just published a handbook, which is free, and I've got copies on the stand just behind. If I run out, it's also available free as a download from our website. So there's lots of the stuff that I'm talking about is detailed in the book. But there's a number of case studies showing practical examples of where you get increases. So there was one that showed a 17% increase in milk yield where the trees were protecting the dairy cows. There's another one that showed 10 to 21% increase in live weight gain for sheep. And then the other key one is around lamb mortality and protecting lambs in extreme conditions, where one study saw a 50% reduction. in land mortality. That was in Australia, but nonetheless, the principles are there. You're protecting your stock from some of these extreme conditions. So the other thing around stock as well is if you've got wet land, and this is something again that the Pond Bren project showed, if you can dry out your land a bit more, you can potentially reduce foot rot, and if you do it strategically, you can reduce the areas where liver fluke are coming in. So there's potentially some real benefits to specific health problems as well. But also some trees can harbour flies, so you still got to get it right, and you've got to plant in the right place. I'm not saying there's an answer for everything, but generally there are trees that will help your system. And just as how am I doing for time? I'm all right. So this is an egg producer, David Brass. He's one of the McDonald's sustainable egg producers, so he's a big-scale egg producer, and he did a study looking at 33 flocks that had tree cover and 33 flocks that didn't, so a big study. And some of the stuff that came out of his study, so it cost him about £2,000 a hectare to plant up his trees, and he reckoned he got a payback in 6 months in his poultry system. And the reasons for that were he got better shell quality on the eggs, so he got fewer breakages. He got a 2% higher percentage of grade A eggs. There was reduced stress, reduced feather pecking, reduced mortality, not a quantifiable one necessarily, but less mud. So his staff were happier when they were going around picking the eggs up. And then also reduced ammonia emissions. So again, that's something that's I think, hitting the foreground, and we've seen some poultry units refused planning permission because of ammonia emissions. Actually, if you can plant trees around, you can show that you're reducing it. And for him, he said there's no downside to planting trees. So I think there are some systems where actually planting trees is almost a no-brainer. I think other times it gets a bit more complicated. So that's the livestock. Silver arable is where you've got crops and trees. So usually that would be planted in what's called an alley cropping system. So in this instance, I think we've got potatoes with short rotation coppice on either side. This is an example from Suffolk at Wakelands. And again, often it's around that idea of slowing down the wind, creating microclimates, increasing biodiversity and soil health. That's another example from Gloucestershire, which is apples and vegetables. And then this is a farmer called Stephen Briggs, who's in Cambridgeshire. His main motivation for his agroforestry system was wind erosion. So he's got, that soil that blows across. His was like that. So he's set up this system where he's got 27 meters between the tree rows. So that allows him a 24-meter strip to cultivate. And that 24 is divisible by 12, 8, 6, 4, 3, and 2. So you can use any piece of machinery between those two rows. So in terms of some of the figures, he's planted up 52 hectares, which cost him $65,000 in 2009. And now that when they were 7 years old, the fruit was then giving him the same yields he reckoned as the wheat, so averaging about £1,000 gross margin a hectare. But on top of that, he then started making his own juice from the apples, and then because he wanted to add value, and so for him, selling commodity crops was a real challenge to make it work. And he was growing unusual stuff. He's growing for the gluten-free market, so he's quite savvy, but he was still struggling to make that arable bit work. But as soon as he diversified and added value, it made more sense. And he's now got to the point where he's opened a farm shop to sell the apple juice that he's producing. So it sort of becomes more and more complicated. But it's an example of how that initial decision to complicate potentially his business has led to that sort of added value. So this is the farm we're working on, Eastbrook Agroforestry. We're trialing different systems in different fields. The first field we've got is kind of more like an extensive orchard, but we've got 19 different species of fruit and nut, including sea buckthorn, almond, goji berry, sort of lots of different soft and top fruit mixed in. We want to run a poultry unit there, but haven't yet found anyone to look after the chickens. So at the moment we're just silaging it. And so that's been planted now for about 2.5 years, just starting to come into production with some of the stuff. And then this is one of the other fields where we've taken that spacing that I talked about with Stephen Briggs. It's actually at the moment a graze system, so with young dairy stock. It's the bottom end of the farm, so the dairy unit is at the other end of the farm. So again, we've got a 27-metre spacing with the idea that although it's grazed at the moment, we might want to crop it at some point in the future. It's very heavy land, so at the moment it's not that suitable for cropping, but we wanted to leave that option open. One of the big things is around protection of trees, particularly where you've got livestock. It's quite expensive and difficult. In this system, we decided to electric fence both sides of every row. So that's a single strand electric wire, mains electric, £1.20 a metre. So quite a big investment in the electric fencing. But what it's enabled the farm manager to do is to institute this rotational mob grazing system that he wanted to do, and it's just a bungee cord at the end of each row. So although you've got a big investment up front, the management of that system going forward is much simpler, and I'm confident that 10,000 volts is going to keep the cattle away from my trees, which it didn't in the first year when we didn't have that fencing. And in this field we've got a mixture. We've got some timber trees and we've got Perry pears, and what we've got is a main species tree interplanted with willow and alder, which we're then going to coppice. So you've got these double stories. But I can talk more about that to people afterwards if they're interested. And then this is our next plan. We had applied for some money from Network Rail, which unfortunately we didn't get. So we might only do half of it this year. So this is quite a long field. It's a 45-acre field. It's about 1 kilometre long. And we're going to try and do some more of those long blocks that you've just seen in the other one, looking at potentially walnut, chestnut, almond, maybe even sort of black locust and paulownia for making our own fence posts and wood chip. Oh my goodness, thank you. Yeah, I'm very near the end, that's fine. And then also looking at these browsing blocks. So this is where you specifically grow an area that you're going to introduce the stock to browse. So that idea that when it's really hot, you might not have much grass, but actually having a little half-acre block of willow or poplar or mulberry that you can bring the stock into, and maybe just for a few days, or you might end up coppicing it and feeding it to them. So just very quickly, you probably know some of the barriers already, but land ownership is a problem. If you don't own your farm, it's quite hard to plant trees on if you're a tenant. Skills are a challenge. Most farmers do not have experience and skill at growing trees, so either you have to learn or it's an opportunity to bring new entrants onto the farm. So what Helen, my boss at the farm, has done, she didn't know about trees, so she's brought me in to do the tree bit. I don't know about livestock. They can do the livestock, I do the trees. So there's some really nice opportunities for partnership and new entrants. Protection, I've talked about protection of the trees is difficult and expensive, and there's lots of options, and it depends what you're trying to do. Markets, always grow for a market. That might be an internal market, that might be for browsing, it might be for wood chip bedding for your livestock, it might be for an on-farm biomass boiler. There's lots of on-farm markets, but equally, if you're growing, unless you're growing oak, in which case, in 100 years' time, who knows what the market will be. But, there are specific markets like cricket-back willow, for instance, that you can grow for where there is a guaranteed market. So to try and do your research on that. And then finally, I guess, is the barrier of perception, which I think is changing. We've had 2,000 people download the digital copy of the handbook. So, I think there's a lot of people now interested in agroforestry, whereas even 5 years ago, that was more difficult. But it is still a bit of a challenge. And the support for agroforestry specifically is not really there yet, although there's noise from government that it will be. So that's it, I think. There are challenges, there are opportunities, but do come and talk to me afterwards. Oh, and just one more thing, sorry. If you are in Pembrokeshire or very near Pembrokeshire, we're just setting up an agroforestry learning network for farmers. We've got some funding from an Interreg project called Fab Farmers. So if you're in that area and you want to join that network, then let me know. Thank you very much.